anger is a very, very normal part of this grief cycle. So when, in this instance, when human beings are denied freedom and have control taken away, anger is a really natural emotional response, but it requires so much energy, and therefore it's not all that sustainable to be angry for long periods of time.
Today on Dirty Linen, we are speaking to Rae Bonney. Rae is an integrated wellbeing specialist with a particular interest in men's health and mental wellbeing. Already spoken to Rae's son on the podcast. If you remember the episode with George Wintle when we were doing Mental Health Fortnight, George spoke so fondly of Rae. It caused me to go and check her out online and look at all the amazing things that she does. And as we think about gearing back up for reopening in Victoria, I thought it was a fantastic time to talk to somebody who is an expert about wellbeing in the workplace. Rae, thanks for joining me on Dirty Linen.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here, Dani. An unexpected pleasure popped up just a couple of days ago, so thanks again for inviting me.
Oh, well, the honour is mine, and I'm sure the things that you're going to say will be of great benefit to the listeners. We do hear so much about the mental health impacts of the pandemic. What kinds of things are we talking about when we say that?
Oh, look, Dani, there is so much confusing and conflatist literature about mental health in the first place, let alone with the emergence of COVID. And, speaking more specifically about the hospitality industry now, it's the seventh largest industry here in Australia, and it employs close to about 1 million people. So that's a lot of people being affected during the pandemic. And I guess when we're talking about things that lead to poor mental health as a result of COVID, there are just so many that impact. The things that spring to mind with me that I'm seeing a lot of is isolation and loneliness is obviously something that's continuing to affect us even here living in Victoria. But things like relationship breakdown, job loss, financial distress, and homeschooling is a big one as well that's affecting people in their homes. And, with that, there's so much uncertainty.
So I guess people in hospitality are in various positions. Some have been working throughout the pandemic, but perhaps in roles that have changed quite a lot. Others have been out of work. As businesses move towards COVID normal, thinking about workplaces and specifically hospitality, what kinds of things might we expect to see, whether it's behaviours that you might want to look out for in others or things that you might want to keep an eye out for yourself?
It's a really good question, Dani, because I think people returning after COVID, there's certain kinds of cohorts. We've got the cohorts of people who absolutely can't wait to get back. They're missing the connection with their occupation, with their workmates, and just sort of being free to move about. And then there's the other camp of people who are very, very comfortable in isolation. And they're people who perhaps maybe live with things like social anxiety, or just those kinds of profiles of people who work very, very well within isolation, who are now feeling quite terrified about returning. But, if it was difficult before to identify changes in behaviours in self and others, the mask is making it even more difficult to read faces. So we really have to be looking a lot closer, not just with our eyes, but, sensing changes like in tone of voice is a really good one. Physical appearance, and that's like, weight loss and weight gain. It's not like, oh, gee, you did really well in COVID losing all that weight. Anything that's changed is an opportunity to check in with people and perhaps, ask a question. One of my favourite ones, Dani, is what does it feel like being you today? Because that actually requires an answer.
Wow, that is a great question, but it could be quite a confronting one, not only to hear, but to say. I think a lot of people, it definitely goes deeper than "Are you okay?" doesn't it?
Absolutely. It is super clunky. But, typically here in Australia, a conversation goes, hey, go mate, yeah, good. And that's it. So there's no opportunity for anyone. I mean, many people have been using Zoom to communicate, whether it's within business or even personally. But I notice when I get on Zoom calls with an audience and the first question is, how is everyone? The answer is always, yeah, good, fine. And I could bet my bottom dollar that that's certainly not the case.
It's really interesting what you say about the mask and how it affects the way we relate to one another. As you know, I'm wearing a mask. I want to talk to someone and I want to have a meaningful conversation. I want them to feel like they can open up to me if necessary. What kinds of things can I do to demonstrate my openness to hearing, what's really going on for someone?
We have lots of different parts of our body, Danny, and hands are really, really good at gesticulating. I make sure when I go on a couple of walks a day, and if I pass somebody, I'll just raise my hand to say hi, and I'll kind of crinkle my eyes up a little bit as well to make it look like I might be smiling. And some of those kinds of things just gives, uh, passers-by or people who are in your zone, just that reassurance that everything's okay and that you can see them and you have noted them and acknowledge
Yeah.
them.
It's so important to be seen, isn't it? Especially when you feel like you don't quite look like yourself when you're all covered up. And I worry about coming into the warmer weather, with sunglasses, hats, and a mask. It's going to be really hard to be yourself out there in public, isn't it?
That's right. And if you hit the nail on a really good head in terms of our style, how we style ourselves and, how we take our faces out into the world with, our identity. And that's been somewhat lost because we've not only not been able to take our identities and our styles out there, but also now it's been covered up. So we're all kind of, apart from the colour of your mask, really, we all look pretty much the same.
And it's just speaking a bit more about identity. I think so many people in hospitality have taken a large part of their identity from their work, I guess, as people do in all kinds of fields of work and engagement. But I think for hospitality people, and the service, the rhythm of service, the rhythm of a busy restaurant is something that really marked the week for people. You'd have your adrenaline would kick in at a certain time, you'd crash at a certain time. The patterns of your body really bought into were all part of that restaurant rhythm. I feel like for people who are stepping back into that world, and as things get busier, but perhaps they won't be the same. I mean, I feel like that might be quite a jolt for people and have different impacts.
Definitely. I think people haven't really understood the impact of this very, very unusual happening. And, human beings, typically very resilient. And here in Australia, we're also very stoic and, you just get on with it and just get up and get on with it. And which many people have, but have really missed kind of some of those behaviours that emerge. And it's, if it was difficult before to identify behaviours in others before the mask, it's now making it even more difficult to read faces and also, as we said before, asking somebody what it's like. So when we're re-entering the workplace, we're still in this stage of grief. Because many people associate grief, say, primarily with death and loss of significant relationships and things. And we don't realise that this time of such extraordinary change where, so many freedoms are being denied, our daily activities are banned, and isolation from other ones just happens to be kind of a life-saving necessity. People are having difficult coming to terms with their kaleidoscope of emotion. So becoming familiar with that process of grief is really useful in helping make sense of yours and others out of character behaviour. And there are 5 very distinct stages that I think, we've been seeing during COVID, but I think once we return to the workforce or return to what they call normal, we're going to see some of these behaviours. And the first one, I think most of us can remember the stage of denial. And that sort of happened very early in the piece with COVID, where everyone's going, oh, it's just old people, it's not going to happen to me. They were just making a big deal. And I think big deal out of nothing. And I think some of us are a bit embarrassed about our attitudes towards that. But denial is really, really important in the stage of grief because it keeps us safe in that moment while we absorb the enormity of what's going on. And it took us a while to do that. And then, stage 2, and I know that you wanted to talk about this too, Dani, is we're seeing a lot of anger in people. And anger, different to violence, but anger is a very, very normal part of this grief cycle. So when, in this instance, when human beings are denied freedom and have control taken away, anger is a really natural emotional response. And many of us are still in this stage at the moment, but it requires so much energy, and therefore it's not all that sustainable to be angry for long periods of time. So the next stage people generally move into is the bargaining stage, and COVID's commandeered our lives almost overnight, and it's difficult to imagine that just back in January, we were effortlessly buying toilet paper, socialising and touching each other, and even going on holidays and stuff. Um, but we start making deals with ourselves, like once this is all over, I'm gonna go on more holidays. I'm going to be kinder to the environment. Whatever it might be, we get into this bargaining stage for when we come out of it. But even that can sometimes just be a little bit draining as well, because COVID's just endless. It just keeps on going. So all the bargaining isn't working. And that's where people can slip down that rabbit hole in the next stage, which is depression. You come down from these really heightened feelings of anger and bargaining and feel really unexpectedly sad and dejected. And I think all of us have either felt that or we've observed it in others. And it's a certain it's one of the most concerning stages of the grief cycle, because it's a time without people getting back into their routines and connecting with support services, that people that can linger on and become more sinister. And the final stage, of course, is acceptance, and that's not accepting this where you're all okay with the situation, but it's pretty much saying that we're not happy about the situation, but we know that we have to, say, comply with restrictions, or we have to just go with this new normal of life for now. And then, that cycle can go up and down, up and down. So anger, will emerge, and then denial will emerge. And so when we get back into the workplace, when we're seeing these behaviours, be really kind, be very accepting, and then ask that question, what is it like for you? I can tell you what it's like for me, but knowing that those stages are very, very normal.
Yeah, it's interesting because as you were talking, I was thinking that people went back into anger or that denial came around again. But I think it's because the grief comes around in a new form or there's another wave of it. And I think particularly in Victoria, when we went into our second wave and this current lockdown, there wasn't the energy of the first lockdown. The people didn't have that energy to throw at it. And it was, I guess, a renewed grief of like, oh, like, what do you mean we actually just can't deal with this and move on? This is, as you say, this is still with us.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And we still don't know when it's going to end, because we've, as you said, we've been in, we've been out, and we've been back in again. That we know that that's possible as well, because it's now in our repertoire of experience to know that that's possible.
Mm. So it's such an uncertain world for us. And I wonder when things are so uncertain, I mean, you can't just, change your attitude and change the situation. It's like you actually have to live in it. What can that do for our mental health? And indeed, there must be physical impacts as well.
Oh, definitely. And look, I guess no one's immune to uncertainty, Dani, and our normal lives are full of constant change. In fact, I was speaking to somebody, I was in a committee meeting yesterday, and everyone's going, oh, nothing's ever going to be the same again, and when it all returns to normal, everything's going to be changed. And I said, well, that's kind of been consistent from the dawn of time, guys, because if backtrack 100 years ago, you can be pretty certain that things have changed. So change is certain, and we're forever making decisions based on uncertain outcomes. But the uniqueness of COVID is the immensity of the problem and the unexpected and unknown global consequences, where we're uncertain of the economic and social costs, travel, all of those kinds of things. So this could be the beginning of a global societal collapse, or is it the birth of a new era? Whichever way you look at it, I like to go a bit more on the positive side, but no one can accurately predict when the pandemic will end, and what reverberating impacts it will have on personal and societal structures. So this is a vastly different kind of uncertainty. And there are many ways we can sort of feel more certain about the uncertainty, especially when we're able to take control and understand managing our energy for the greater good. And I've noticed with people understanding your capacity for adaptability. You know, people like resilience have all varying different levels of adaptability and agility. So it's important to embrace these differences and help emerge qualities and attributes in ourselves and others to help manage. So, you know, you're returning, as you said, you know, to the high energy kitchen, and you know everyone's on again, and we know we've got to do service and it's a big day. There are some people that are not going to have as much energy as you, or vice versa, and that's the time to check in with people to say, it's okay, how do I help you through this moment, rather than, you know, judging people based on our own capacity for adaptability. Because, you know, back in the day, Dani, we used to rap on about IQ being the big thing. You know, what's your IQ? That makes you really smart. But we quickly learned that, you know, EQ, that's the emotional quotient, was really important to be able to demonstrate the IQ. But I think in this, there's another part to that, which is the AQ, and that's the adaptability quotient. So with the IQ, we need the EQ, but we can't do any of it without the AQ, and that's the ability to adapt to change. So it's it kind of makes sense, doesn't it?
It definitely does make sense. And what it also makes me think is that it would be really important and strategic for people to have things that they can control that they don't need to adapt to, whether it's just something like starting the day with a particular cup of tea, or, you know, walking a certain way, or doing something with the dog or the kid, or whatever it is that's really controllable and consistent, and that you don't need to adapt to everything all the time.
Exactly, and that's what I think routines have been the most critical part of managing better through COVID, and and those routines have to be a little bit more specific because we're sitting in these environments. You know, many of us in isolation, where we're looking at the same walls every day, and you might live in the most beautiful house with the most beautiful kids, and I do. I'm one of those very lucky people, but our brains are like scanners. So we're always scanning our environment for things like danger, joy, you know, curiosity. Love, that's a nice dress. Oh, look at that dog. Or, you know, we're getting on a train and, you know, we're always scanning all day long. And now our brains are still scanning. They're still scanning the environment for these, you know, pieces of curiosity, but it's not connecting to anything. So that's why people are starting to feel so really exhausted, you know, by just sitting in the same spaces, because we're not igniting that pilot light, and it's just falling dead all the time. So I'm really curious to see when people do run back out into the world, uh, how our brains adapt to that, whether they're more hypersensitive to environment, or whether we need to re-hone some of those instincts.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I suppose our horizons will be smaller, at least in terms of, I guess, international travel and going out and seeing the world and really stimulating ourselves in that way. Uh, but I think people, even in Melbourne, where we're restricted to 5 kilometres, I think a lot of people have found that there is so much to discover in their own neighbourhood or their own backyard. So it's surprising. Yeah, the interest that you can find in even just, yeah, tiny things. I suppose it's that, smelling the roses, noticing the butterflies, noticing the grass, the green shoots grass of growing, whatever it is. So I suppose there are different ways to engage our minds and to find things to spark us.
And I think that that's really happened. I love how, you know, community has become, well, it's really emerged as something very important. And that, you know, you said, you know, probably as an analogy, looking in your backyard, but literally people are looking in their backyards and over their fences and engaging with their community like never before. And I think that that's really good, especially for industries like hospitality that do rely on their communities for their livelihood.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of hospitality businesses have felt so grateful for the community that's around them and have been so buoyed by the fact that there is a community that wants to support them and wants to keep that business going. So it's there for all of them on the other side. How do you think that hospitality businesses can make the most of that to really cherish those communities, and to be, I guess, to energize, to use that energy to keep themselves going, but also to feed back into the community that supports them?
Well, I had the opportunity to chat with a friend last night. He's a chef, Daniel Greenwood. In fact, my George and he worked together years ago at Hellenic Republic, and then Dan went on to Town Mouse and then ended up at Levantine Hill out at Coldstream. But he and his partner, Emily, they opened restaurant St Lawrence out at Hurstbridge about 6 months before COVID hit. And, he said when they first heard the announcements, there was definitely a bit of shock and uncertainty. He said, but they were just forced to think on their feet and try and put themselves in the shoes of their community instead of really considering, the risk to keeping their business open or operating. Their first thought directly went to what will our community need from us? And, he sort of said, hospitality is very much that stick to what you know industry, but it's really misconstrued as a main focus. And the real essential element, he said, and always should be, is the art of providing. So when they got stripped back to what they knew best, like indoor dining and tasting menus and stuff, Dan and Em were sort of forced to pivot and adapt to ensure they still operated as providers for the people around them. And I loved it when he said that, because I've seen what they've done with their business, and they're all cakes and pies and, food boxes and things like that, that he said, they're operating pretty much like, having sort of reasonable days in the normal world.
Mm. That's, yeah, so interesting. I wonder how much of that will linger and in what ways it will in various restaurants and food businesses we have around the state. Because a lot of people open restaurants because they've got their vision of what they want to provide. But I think everything's been so upended. People have had such an opportunity to reconsider their purpose and, what it actually means to run a hospitality business. So it will be so interesting to see, I guess, certainly what diners want from businesses, but also what these businesses are prepared to give them.
Well, that's right, Danny. And I think, like other industries, hospitality, for those who have really honed in on the AQ, that agility and adaptability, like Dan and Em, now have a plan B as well. So I think before COVID, a lot of what I'm seeing is people who aren't managing very well only had a plan A. And I think hospo is very resonant of that, there was just, this is what we do. And it's not having that, what will we do if, because we just take things for granted. So I think a lot of these businesses now have a what if plan because they've done it, they've experienced it, and it can also be additional to their business. So some businesses, when they go back to business as usual, will also have an additional revenue stream as well, which is really, really handy. And I think that helps build that business resilience. And, I mentioned to you the other day on the phone, I do a lot of work in mental health for the Australian entertainment industry. And many Australian entertainment industry workers supplement their income through hospitality because, they work in this gig economy all the time. So they always need, a couple of plan A's and 10 plan B's. So one of those is hospitality. And that disappeared for them as well. So, we see a lot in that industry as well, how people have recreated themselves through technology but some fantastic success stories of people being really ingenious.
Yeah, we've certainly have seen so much creativity, and especially in, creative industries like entertainment and hospitality, I would say is a very creative industry as well. Have you seen other positive impacts out of the pandemic?
Uh, definitely, absolutely, definitely. I think the basic kindness of people, our ability to, as I said, adapt and be agile. The human condition never fails to astound me, Dani. I think that's why I spend my life working in it. But yeah, people's ability to be grateful as well. I think gratitude has been riding very, very high for so many. And I know for myself that I do consider myself one of the luckiest people in the world because I have a safe home. My children are healthy and well employed, and so am I. And we're healthy. So that does make us the luckiest people in the world.
I've been feeling like really quite actively grateful for being able to turn on the tap and really lovely, cool, clean water comes out. It's just so, I'm so glad that I can have a shower every day and have a glass of water whenever I want. I should probably have more glasses of water, but I know that I can at any moment. So, yeah, I think there's definitely, maybe that seems trite or silly, but it's actually just a bit of a privilege to be able to do that. And we definitely do take it for granted.
Yeah. And I think that the upside, what you've just said, is that we didn't have these senses before because we live in this world of instant gratification where we just push a button and something arrives on our doorstep. Or, somebody even said to me the other day the impact on people's health is quite terrible because we don't have access to as much as we used to. And I said, reverse that thought and think about our instant gratification sense of entitlement society that we indulge ourselves in anything, whether it's materialistic stuff or even food. We overeat, we can buy anything, we throw it away, and that causes things like, for our health system, things like obesity, heart disease, diabetes. All of those things are a result of this overly enthusiastic need to engage and have. So I'm hoping that some of our new behaviours will be a little more, conservative and thoughtful about around how we consume.
Well, you mentioned the health impacts, but you also could just as easily have talked about environmental impacts, which of course consumption and, just the notion that we should be able to have whatever we want, whenever we want, however we want. It's yeah, certainly not doing the planet any good. So I really do hope that people will feel a bit more connected to the impacts that their consumption has in that regard.
Yeah, well, I had this idea, Dani, instead of putting up the COVID stats every day, perhaps they could additionally put up the statistics on how the planet is improving at a rate of knots, because it is. But we're not hearing that news, and that's such positive, inspiring stuff that people will be more, engaged in continuing some of these new behaviours after COVID for our planet.
Well, yeah, I suppose in terms of, yeah, not as much driving around, is certainly a benefit. I mean, there's still plenty of devastating environmental news that could be aired very widely so that people could perhaps be shocked into personal action, but also political change. But that's a, that's a big conversation. Rae, do you think that there'll be any, quote, pandemic syndromes that we'll need to attend to as a society for a long time?
I think some of the things we just spoke about, hopefully they are syndromes that are really positive that keep carrying through. But I did hear that some researchers over in Cleveland in the USA identified a rise in broken heart syndrome during COVID. It's also called something like stress cardiomyopathy, but it occurs in response to really stressful events. So COVID has brought about multiple levels of stress in people's lives across the world. They're not only worried about themselves and their families becoming ill, but also, dealing with the economic and emotional issues, societal problems, and, the underscored loneliness and isolation as well. But, it was interesting to see what, some of these, psychophysical kind of responses that people are having to the pandemic. And, afterwards, who knows? Who knows? I think, even looking back to the early days, and I listen, to some of the stuff I was talking, about back in March, and, predicting what was going to happen, in the future. Like, I was working with the University of Melbourne at the time, and I was working with their School of Engineering, which also includes their computer science school. So a lot of those people in that school were actually taken into the government to do the modelling around the virus. And it was fascinating to hear what their predictions were in the early stages. And some of them were bang on, absolutely bang on about, having this second wave thing here. And but still, I think the uncertainty thing is something for us to kind of embrace, to say, we don't know, but let's stay in the moment and let's really, really focus on the moment and resist the temptation to jump forward and panic or jump backwards and blame.
I love it. As I also feel in what you're saying, that we need to use our reserves of kindness and dispense kindness liberally in every direction, not only to those around us, but also to ourselves.
Oh, absolutely. And it sounds a bit cliche, just be kind to yourself. Um, but kind doesn't mean looking at yourself in the mirror and saying you're awesome. It's actually taking time out to be in that moment when, homeschooling, for example, which has caused untold stress to so many families. Like, really, does it matter that you complete every single thing on those endless, um, study sheets every week? I've got an 11-year-old, and he, I was very fortunate to have George home for half of the pandemic. So, George is helping Rory, make feta cheese and teaching him how to cook, and and through that he learns how to measure. I remember the first time they did feta cheese, and I think George got the measurements wrong, and that had to be tipped down the sink. But everyone learnt somebody then, yeah. But there are so many ways we can approach some of these difficulties, or when you're feeling things are dragging, have another look through another lens and say, how can I achieve the same result, but with happiness, with a bit of laughter, chuck on vines or something like that and have a look at those. We do that every now and then, and just laugh.
Nice. Rae Bonney, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you and to have some strategies, not only to cope with what's going on, but also to look at what is going on in the people around us, and to, just to have strategies to be kind and to come through the pandemic as much as we can with shining a light of positivity onto the things that are happening. So thank you so much for having a chat to me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Dani Valent. And don't forget that question, what does it feel like being you today?
Perfect. Thank you, Rae. This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about. We spend a week thrashing around each issue, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtylinen@deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta at Dirty Linen Podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.
This is a Deep in the Weeds production.